computer. That's what I'm going to do. Okay. Um, yeah, it must feel like you're in, uh, caught in a time loop of some kind, or, you
Yeah.
know, you're all, have to be the adults in the room for a crisis unlike anything you've ever experienced.
Well, you remember during Katrina,
Yeah.
like Katrina happened and then it ended, and then we were cleaning up. And so it's not that we didn't have to work on it over a long period of time, because we did, but the emergency was over and we were just trying to put things back together. Whereas now the emergency is underway the entire time. You have an outbreak in Winooski now. Does that mean we have to go back to quarantine? Does it not mean that? So there's that ongoing sense that the emergency is just hanging like a cloud,
Yeah.
and you're trying to work underneath it as it hangs. And it's, I don't know if you've seen, many people are retiring that you would never have expected. But I think it's just burning people out,
Yeah.
right and left.
Yeah. It's
And
tough because I'm sure you guys are thinking, this is not what I signed up for. And yet,
it,
you ran for public office, you're our leaders. So it's,
yeah,
whether or
but I
not you
mean,
wanted it.
so you're an activist. Um, Activism has changed so radically in the last 4 months.
Yeah.
Everybody's trying to do what they're expected to do in completely new and different ways, which is something that, it adds some life to your daily existence, which is always good, but you're constantly feeling as though you're operating machinery you're familiar with, but with your left hand or with your feet or whatever. So,
Wow. Yeah, I can imagine you're gonna want a long, long nap when you're
yeah.
released from all of this. So, um, I wanted to talk to you about this op-ed that you wrote in VT Digger, which basically suggested funding Vermont's beleaguered college system with cannabis revenue, and that we fast track S54 and get ourselves a tax and regulated market so that we can support the state college system. So I want to let you elaborate on that a little bit. And was this something that you'd been thinking about for a while, or
Yeah.
middle of the night, 3 o'clock in the morning?
Well, yeah. So the basic slogan that I came up with a couple of years ago was tax, regulate, educate. And the idea was to move away from the original versions of the Senate bills, directed money pretty much exclusively to law enforcement. And especially in the current moment when we're rethinking the way we fund police and military and quasi-military governmental groups, um, didn't seem like the direction to be going in. But all along, my thought has been that most other states have used their cannabis money, their liquor money, their lottery money, what are traditionally known as vice taxes. They've used those to educate. And the slogan is usually kids win too. The California lottery started that and it spread. And I think there's even a general expectation out there that those kind of taxes will go for these sorts of expenses, educating our young kids, but on up through grade 16, as we sometimes call it. So, more recently, the Vermont State Colleges suddenly fell upon the hardest of times in history, and we're looking at closing roughly half their campuses. And so in that existential moment, the legislature stepped in and said, we will offer bridge funding for a year on the order of $25–30 million. But look a year out, they're still going to need an infusion of between $15 and $20 million every year, over and above the $30 million that we usually give them. So my thought was that if you take 2/3 of what I believe is, sort of a conservative estimate of what we might bring in with tax and regulate, That gets you about $16 million. And if we dedicated that in perpetuity, what I call a public endowment, dedicate that to the state colleges, never to be diverted, and give them the 30 plus million going forward, adjusted for inflation as we go, that would bring them up to the 30% support level that is the average in New England for state colleges. And it's not that that would fix everybody's problem, but it would fix the main problem, which is that we have always underfunded the state colleges. And there's a statute in Title 16 that requires us to fund the state colleges completely or in substantial part. And it seems to me that S54 is the way to do that. There's one other piece, if I could just go ahead. One other piece that I think is really necessary. If we were to pass S54 and it played out the way the Senate bill works, it would take 2 years before you'd start to realize tax revenues, better part of 2 years. That's too long in terms of the Vermont State Colleges, because then we'd have to bridge for 2 years, and I just don't think we can come up with $60 million for 2 years. So the medical marijuana dispensaries came to us in the Judiciary Committee 2 years ago with a proposal to jumpstart the tax and regulate program by a year by allowing them to use their existing licenses, existing facilities, pipelines, et cetera, security structures, to get a start on tax and regulate, with the idea that the remaining licenses would follow a more measured pace. And if we did that, then, so let's say that I waved my magic wand and S54 came out of conference and the governor signed it by July 15th. In a year, theoretically, we could be realizing millions of dollars in tax revenue from that early start with the medical marijuana dispensaries. If we did that, the bridge funding year that we've pledged to the state colleges would dovetail perfectly with the beginning of that funding. And so that's what I laid out in that op-ed. I think it's, I wouldn't say that it's a likely scenario, but it is a realistic scenario. And so far as I know, nobody else has put a realistic scenario forward.
So what kind of response are you getting?
Well, I had a lot of people read it. The people who read it tended to be people who are interested either in the state colleges or tax and regulate. Mm-hmm. The people who have been working on tax and regulate, many of them have their own ideas about where the money should go. So they were, not necessarily on board. The people involved with the state colleges were very much behind it. Because again, I referred to it as a public endowment. That's a deliberate wordplay on the private endowments that institutions like Middlebury and UVM have. Mm-hmm. You know, Middlebury has over $1 billion. UVM has hundreds and hundreds of millions, near $1 billion. And so they're not looking at, you know, they have troubles, don't get me wrong. COVID-19 has given everybody financial troubles, but their troubles are backstopped by hundreds of millions or billions of dollars, whereas the state college system does not have an endowment. So this would be a way of saying, in the next 10 years, you will have in the hundreds of millions yourself from tax and regulate. So
I was looking at the comments on VT Digger, which I know can tend towards generally the most heated people, but here are some of the questions that people were asking. I'm seeing comments fall into a few main camps. One is a claim that you have a conflict of interest because you teach at UVM, but it sounds like what you're saying is that UVM wouldn't be a part of this funding?
Right, and you know, in the State House, there's a kind of long-standing arrangement where if you give $1 to UVM, you give $1 to the state colleges and $1 to VSAC, or 50 cents to VSAC. And so all three of those institutions the two educational institutions get the same amount, but UVM gets, let's say, if we're going to give 5 million, UVM gets 5 million, the state college system gets 5 million, but that's split among their various campuses. And then VSAC maybe would get 1.5 million or something. That's how the split normally works. And I think that's fair enough. It's in the state's interest to keep both healthy and not to have them competing with each other for dollars constantly. But in this moment, the state college system has an existential crisis and UVM has a financial crisis. And so I think we need to think about dedicating this funding stream to the Vermont State Colleges without diverting it also to UVM or VSAC, and then help UVM with one-time money to get them through this financial crisis. But if I could just quickly address the conflict of interest. I work at UVM, my wife works at UVM, and that's public information. I'm a member of a union at UVM, and I've been accused of conflicts of interest all the way around. People at UVM have accused me of having a grudge against them because I work there. And that's why I won't, for instance, in this case, cut them in on my plan for how I would ideally use the tax and regulate money. And people who are not members of a union have accused me of being in the tank for unions because I'm a member. You know, however you slice it in Vermont, people have 5 or 10 different connections, small state, many people doing many things at once.
Right.
So anybody who says that doesn't know me very well. That's all I'd say.
Now, other folks have been saying that the money is premature because you should fix whatever is inherently wrong within the state college system before you go giving them large amounts of cash.
Right.
What do you say to that?
Fair enough. But if you think about it just a little bit, what those people are saying is let's wait 2 years until we go through this entire long process to figure out how to reorganize the system. Chancellor Spalding, before he left office, put out a plan that talked about closing 3 of the campuses. So if I'm a prospective student and I'm looking at NVU or Southern New Hampshire University, those are my choices. I Google NVU and I find out, oh, great, the state's thinking about closing it. I'm going to go to Southern New Hampshire University. So it's not hard to see how prospective students in the next year or two, absent any new commitment from the state, are going to drift away. That makes the whole thing worse and worse. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy at that point that the institutions can't pull themselves out of the hole. So what I've said is, let's dedicate this money from tax and regulate now. Then with that, sort of taking care of the question of whether we are committed to these institutions, then engage in this process of renovation, rethinking, reworking the system. And maybe that means that, for instance, the 2 NVU campuses consolidate onto one campus. Maybe it means that, one of the 3 campuses that was slated for closure actually does close. I'm not forestalling those possibilities at all. What I'm saying is, as we make those decisions, we need to act quickly to show prospective students, and by the way, faculty and the communities involved, that we're serious about a new funding stream.
So that would probably be a response to the folks who say you should be funding the elementary schools rather than the colleges.
Right, those people are, and I hope they all are watching this, because it would be great to be able to just, it's maddening sometimes to read those comments, because they just say things that aren't true, and I could spend all day pointing out that they're not true. People were saying that I was a trustee of the Vermont State Colleges and I was in the tank for that reason. I've never been a trustee. But the people who are talking about the K through 12 system are people that want the weighting study that UVM finished last year. which says that our weighting formula, how we fund the K through 12 system, is biased against rural schools, and it's also biased against communities that host large numbers of immigrants and ELL students. So Burlington, Winooski, and then rural communities like those in Essex and Orleans counties, they've been getting screwed. And so in my committee, we put out a bill to move forward on the weighting study. It's now stuck in finance, but people don't understand the procedures. So they think I'm holding it up when in fact I was the only person who moved it out. So it's alive now as a concept because my committee kept it alive, but it's stuck in another committee. But you know, you can't really communicate those subtleties. So,
Right.
yeah.
So then here comes my next question, which I know the cannabis community is who's watching really. So there also seems to be some concern about anything that looks like fast tracking for the dispensaries.
Yeah.
And the feeling that they're not locally owned, they're not well run, they're overpriced, the quality of the cannabis is poor. There's all kinds, we've been hearing all kinds of problems for years. And as you mentioned, they're regulated by the Department of Public Safety at a time when we're calling for reduction in funding for police, and we don't have a cannabis control board yet that could potentially take over the medical program. So there's a lot of feeling in a segment of the cannabis community that any benefits solely accrued by the dispensaries are profoundly unfair.
Yeah.
How do you respond to that?
I agree. And if you read the op-ed, I say that when this was brought forward 2 years ago, I opposed it. And I opposed it for just that reason in terms of what was fair. So we had a lot of testimony from people who had been disadvantaged during the war on drugs and who had picked up this or that small charge that would tend to hold them out of the license holding process. And so we talked a lot about how to make sure that licenses were available and jobs were available to people who had been caught up in the war on drugs. We also talked about how to make sure that it wasn't out of state, operations that wound up owning everything, how small growers could maintain a big impact. But then lastly, how to make sure that everybody had a fair start at the licenses from the get-go. And I actually won that argument. When I was making it, I was the only one making it in a committee of 5. I wound up convincing 2 other people, and so that proposal died. But let's fast forward to now, post-COVID, Vermont State Colleges tanking. And again, the idea that if we wait an additional year to get tax proceeds coming in, and this is partly because the House and the governor have dragged their feet for so many years now. So I started thinking, on balance, given where we are now, if there's a way to get a revenue stream started a year early, can we mitigate some of the conditions you talked about? Can we move it out of the Department of Public Safety? Can we start the Cannabis Control Board, at the same time that we get some of the product moving? So the advantage to, having the dispensaries involved, I think, is that they do have a track record, they do have locations, they do have product already, they do have licenses, and the state has a relationship with them. So, it's a problem either way. If we wait, the 2 years, that's an additional $30 million for the state colleges that the state's going to have to pony up. And no one has talked about where that money will come from, but it would tend to come out of social services and other programs. So you know how it is, Kathy. It's in the world of government finance, it's always robbing Peter to pay Paul. So on balance, it seemed like starting the revenue stream early was better than not doing so.
So you're trying very hard to not let the perfect or even the really good be the enemy of the good in a crisis situation. It sounds like what you're
But
saying.
exactly, but the point about public safety being in charge, that's a real problem. And you know, the head of public safety, going back time out of mind, has always opposed the initiative. And believe me, I never like when he comes into committee. Well, now we have a new commissioner who I think feels differently about it. But the old head of public safety would come in and basically just try to throw as much dirt on what we were doing as possible. And then it always took us a couple of weeks to clean off everything after he had left.
Yeah.
So it was never a fun job.
So you got a challenge there because basically the whole medical program being managed by the Department of Public Safety is a legacy of prohibition. It's a legacy of attitudes about cannabis, which are fundamentally out of date now.
Mm-hmm.
And it takes time, I'm getting the impression, to move all of the systems into the present moment.
Absolutely. You mentioned prohibition and liquor. So we're what's called a heavy control state. So when you walk into your liquor store, the state of Vermont owns all those bottles. We control it until you buy it. The state owns it. So if a tornado hits your liquor store, it's the state of Vermont that is going to take the loss.
Right.
And there are advantages to that, but I've always said, why on earth should the state in the 21st century be in the liquor business? There are better ways to do it without us having to obsess over every bottle. And in terms of cannabis, I think it's a very similar thing. It's coming out of a legacy of reefer madness, and we got to watch this seed to sale, because if we don't, a seed could roll out and some child could find it, and it'd be horrible. We've got more experience than that now, and hopefully more sense. So, I am hopeful that a cannabis control board can be staffed by people with enlightened attitudes rather than people who are there to, keep a whip hand on the operation.
So right before everything shut down, I know that we'd passed the bill out of the House and the Reconciliation Committee had been put together, and then everything tanked. Where are we in the process right now? Is the committee going to be able to pick it back up before things shut down again?
Honestly, we are in a place we have been in before, and you've seen it. I know you've watched it very closely, but the Senate has sent cannabis bills 4 or 5 times, 6 times to the House. They move through the process seemingly like any other bill, and then we've never seen a black hole. We know there are black holes because you can calculate the forces. And so calculating the forces, you intuit that there's a black hole. And so all I can tell you is that the cannabis bill is not moving now. There is no reason that you could find why it's not moving. But if you calculate the forces, it has to be a force big enough in the House to completely stop a committee and prevent them from meeting. So that's what I will say.
Is there a way that the cannabis community can light a fire?
I think elected officials are always, are always susceptible to people pushing. That's partly what I was trying to do with this op-ed, is a way to say, look, we have not just the normal run of financial problems, which are dire in a poor state like Vermont. We have now that times 10. And, this is something that's been worked over so much. We've shaken so many of the bugs out of this. It's ready to go. The governor, I don't know if people are aware, but earlier this year, the governor took an initiative that that my committee had come up with, an after-school initiative, and I pitched him on using the cannabis money for that. And he said, that sounds great. And he made it one of his conditions for signing the bill. So the governor has now himself gotten into the business of saying, I want the money to be used for this. So that would be $2 or $3 million. I think that would sit nicely beside this Vermont State College initiative. All a way of saying the governor has now moved beyond I'll sign it to I'll spend the money this way.
Aha.
So
Okay.
we're ready to go, but the House is in charge of the conference committee because it's a Senate bill, and the conference committee cannot meet until the House calls the conference committee into existence.
Okay, that's a procedural piece that I think most people don't know.
Yeah. So actually, to be technical, the House committee exists, the Senate committee exists, but the chair is in the House because it's a Senate bill, and that chair calls the meeting, but clearly that chair is not calling the meeting for reasons that they would be best asked themselves.
And who is that chair?
You know, I can't
You're not
tell
allowed
you
to tell
because
us?
no, I don't know right off the top of my head,
Okay.
but it's pretty easy to find out. It's public record. And,
All right. We will go to the public record and find out.
yeah.
And so it sounds like it's now incumbent upon the cannabis community once again to try to jumpstart the process.
I would have to say, yeah, I mean, I had hoped to light a fire under the Vermont State College community because, as you know, they had some very large and loud and successful protests when the plan came out to close their campuses.
Right.
So I had hoped that maybe if both communities got fired up and acted in concert, that we could get some real movement.
Okay.
But again, just so everybody knows, we're going to take a break in about 3 weeks. Then we're going to come back for about 3 weeks in August. If the bill is not passed by the end of August, it dies. So then you have to start from scratch next year and move the entire process again. So all a way of saying that the next 2 months, if it's, you know, your passion to have this bill not die, this is the time.
And the challenge also being that you guys are all still working remotely, yeah?
Yeah.
So it's not like we can just show up at the State House en masse
Right.
and make
But I will say this, all of the hearings for all of the committees and, you know, the all Senate caucus calls, all House caucus calls, those are all live streamed on YouTube.
Okay.
And people are paying attention to how many views there are of these. And when there are very few views, people don't get nervous. And when there are a lot of views, they do get nervous, especially if people use the comment function on YouTube to speak back to the people who are on the YouTube video. So that's an avenue. And then, of course, email to your legislators. But we're honestly, we're getting deluged these days because of the COVID money, and every advocacy organization wants to direct those funds. So my box already has hundreds of emails.
Right.
So there are other ways of putting pressure. You know, in the old days, you know, pre-COVID, you'd go to the State House and take over the space.
Mm-hmm.
And now space is just non-existent. So people have to get creative.
Okay. Good insider info. Thank you very much. Well, I appreciate your interest and your ongoing advocacy yourself from within the walls, and we will take this to our community, and hopefully it will be of great value to everybody.
Can I just end by saying to whoever at Heady hired Kathy Blume. Good move, because Kathy is the one person I can think of who actually, gives personality and life to these sorts of, I feel like legislative pushes can have this completely dry feel to them. But I think the hallmark of the work you've done on climate change has been, I would go every time you did your one woman show on climate change. I would just marvel over it. So that's my last suggestion to you is one woman show on S54, Kathy Blume.
Not a bad idea. All right, I'm going to stop the recording.